Hello and welcome to the J Plus R movie podcast. Today we will be discussing two Scott Adkins indie action movies. One called Ninja, came out in 2009, and another one called Avengement that came out 10 years later in 2019. First of all, we'll be discussing a Ninja.
So Ninja follows an American ninja called Casey Bowman as he tries to protect a legendary set of ninja gear from a rival ninja assassin.
That's the easiest way to sum the film up because it does begin with quite a bit of setup, but after a while it does sort of fit into mold. Just, there's the MacGuffin, which is that like ancient ninja costume and the weapons. I don't have a very high opinion of these. I wouldn't necessarily say direct to video because I don't think this one was entirely direct to video. I'm sure it
did have a cinematic release. I think,
but obviously still, it's made for a much lower budget than your average Hollywood action movie. Typically, the reason why I don't have a high opinion is just because that kind of area of filmmaking is stereotyped as one where formerly big, great action stars go to when their career dries up and they don't really, and they're not being offered work. So they take on these cheap, generic movies that are just sort of ones where they can show up and get a paycheck. But the thing that makes Scott Adkins unique among action stars is that he's kind of conquered that field. He's done major movies as well. He's made a career out of that field.
He's a big name in the kind of cheaper action films.
This one, it does fulfill that mold in a few ways, but it's not one of the worst examples by far. It is definitely watchable. It's lean. It does have in its favor very solid, strong fight choreography as well, and that I think is the reason why it's watchable the most. And also it does actually look good. It's actually a decent film to look at. It's not very blatantly cheap and it does look appealing, I will say that. The action on occasion is very solid and that helps carry you through fairly generic script and fairly generic characters as well.
Aren't too bad either, which does help it.
I have to give credit to the guy who played the titular ninja. He did a really good job, I felt. He was basically the villain of the film, and I thought he was very intimidating. I thought he was very convincing. I even felt kind of bad for him at the beginning. The film opens with this entire backstory showing this temple and how this guy was jealous of Casey and then ended up, trying to kill him in a match, and then he ends up getting banished. He emoted that so well that I was almost like, wow, I feel bad for this guy. I mean, he just got his entire livelihood taken from him.
There's an element of sympathy that is very, very quickly gotten rid of. I think that sequence kind of works. It sets the tone for what the film's going to be. They're very much leaning into the genre and they're not trying to act like they're anything they're not.
The opening stretches of it absolutely feel inspired by classic martial arts film, but that's partially just because it's so set in that dojo. It does feel very classical. It's then mostly set in a lot of other places, especially New York, which is when it takes on a more American tone. But even then, there are still original outlandish elements that they add. Particularly, what kind of complicates the story is that it's not just this guy acting on his own. He's also working for this which is this movie's equivalent of the Illuminati or something.
They're also after it's called the Yomobaritsu for whatever reason.
It's basically just this underground cult that wants power, I guess. That's kind of as deep as it goes. Just as a backdrop, although it does complicate the narrative a little bit, eventually, again, it just does become about find this item, find the MacGuffin. It does help because it then means that although it takes a while to get going, it does eventually, again, settle into this kind of rhythm, and it ends up also becoming this just on-the-run story with Casey and his girlfriend.
I think what that setup really does effectively is it sets the danger of Zuka. It shows how good the sensei is, how good Casey is. So you've got an idea of everyone's abilities to start with, and you get the setup of his relationship with the sensei's daughter, which becomes really, really important for the rest of the film. And then you get Masuka coming in and basically just straight up murking the sensei. It's not even that much of a contest. It's like, oh, you got better.
It's one of those kind of fights where, even though it's obviously mostly one-sided, one who's being beaten still has way more honor than the other guy. It's one of those kinds of fights.
Oh, yeah, no, exactly. In terms of honor, it's definitely down to the sensei, but it kind of sets up that, right, this guy isn't going to fight honorable. Casey is at a disadvantage. It makes the run then feel more tense. And because, he's actually really, really effective at this stealth shit, you're like, oh god, it could be anywhere. And of course, occasionally he does just jump out and do stuff.
Being a formidable opponent does then make the action scenes with him for the rest of the time a lot more effective. It helps as well that Casey isn't an invincible action hero or anything. In both of these films, Scott does show that he's willing to, like, take a blow and be somewhat vulnerable.
He takes more than a couple hits in these films.
Yeah.
I think that's something I like about Scott Adkins films, because as much as he is the ultimate badass kind of action hero, he gets punched a lot.
He's also not afraid to be like the underdog as well, which kind of is in this film. At first, he's not even really involved in the action. He's kind of just a bit peripheral. But then when he comes into play, even there, he is kind of in a position of vulnerability. He is under threat and he is kind of on the run. He's able to handle himself well.
It's not like he can fight off an entire SWAT team.
It's only at the end when he actually becomes a bit smarter, he's able to plan ahead, and he does end up with an advantage. And in that final battle, it's not entirely a curb stomp battle or anything. It's definitely, okay, they're both skilled, but who the hell is going to win? Another thing I appreciated as well about his character, they are somewhat invoking this trope, but they don't lean into it as much as they could have. They don't make him a mighty whitey character.
They don't make him superior to absolutely everybody, and everything that he does, it feels both earned and like he's on the back foot, which is really, really helps to mitigate some of the more problematic elements of having the guy be the ultimate ninja.
Because first of all, he's not even really he's not the ninja of the title. At the end he does dress up in that garb, but he's really, would you say he is the ninja of the title, or would you say it was the other guy?
I think the other guy does more ninja stuff throughout the film. I guess it could refer to both of them. True of ninja can still be ninja, like the ninja.
The way that they kind of handle it is that at first they say he was an orphan and he got taken in and he got raised at the dojo. So as a result, then when you're putting him in the conflict, you can argue that in some ways it is about him avenging the honor of his headmaster and the honor of his dojo. But it never really becomes that. It more just becomes a situation of, okay, these people are trying to kill me, I have to fight them off. And towards the end, it does slightly become more of a, okay, I've got to take the threat out. But it's only really at the end when he decapitates the villain does it really become about Avengement. Funny, given the movie that we're going to talk about next. Only then does it become about avenging his sensei. He's more just put into the hero mold rather than
thrust upon him, and he's more, for most of the film, he's more just doing his duty that his sensei's charged him with and just trying to stay alive. And I think that helps you empathise a lot more with his characters. That adds a good bit of tension to the fights, because he's not approaching this as if he can take on anybody. He's approaching this as, oh shit, I don't have another choice, which instantly makes things feel a bit more desperate. Just to speak about the fights in there. The ones in the opening, they're decent. They do what they do. The stuff in the police building, that to me was one of the highlights of the film, that sequence. I thought that was great from an action perspective, because you get all the shadow lighting and you get that ninja just moving around and you see literally people just dropping it. It's quite bloody. And then Casey both look really competent in it. Because when he takes out Detective Trax, so it's pretty cool. He's trying to make his way through police officers so he can get out, as well as stop the ninja. You get almost 3 levels of threat within the scene to Casey, and because he's also got to protect Namiko throughout that whole thing as well. Well, literally every person in there is against him. It's a good chance for Adkins to show off his martial arts, especially his kicks. Really uses kicks well. It makes the ninja even more threatening somehow. Bazooka just tears through everyone.
Here's the advantage as well of the darkness, which, is the thing that every ninja needs. My favorite action scene was the train fight. Don't get me wrong, the lead up to it was absolutely ridiculous, because if there is one thing I have to point out, it's that this underground secret organization, they are very, very unsubtle. They are not good at covering their tracks.
So obvious.
The branding that they have is on their chest, very visible. It's not in a place that's easily concealable. If you wear a shirt, then it will be concealed. But if somebody saw somebody with their shirt off and they saw that symbol on many other people, then they'd easily be able to recognize it. But that's nothing compared to the fact that when they try and take out Casey and his girlfriend, they basically just open fire on them in a coffee shop.
You just go, you know what? We're going to play this loud. Aren't we a secret society?
They do that. They come in a group. They wear identifiable costumes as well.
They've pretty much got uniforms that go around in as well. It's just not secretive at all.
At the same time, though, so as silly as that is, it does thankfully lead to, again, in my opinion, the best fight in the film, which is, again, that entire train brawl, which is, I think the direction is at its best, and it's also where the choreography is at its most brutal and inventive as well, because it's taking place in a confined space, in a train. It doesn't feel boring or small or anything. It feels very
they still managed to get weapons in there somehow. They managed to use the environment really well. He's using that pole, he's using what's above him, he uses the fucking window.
The two moments that stuck out to me was one where he like jumped through bars, very small looking bars. He managed to like jump and fit through them. And also the bit where his girlfriend gets up the crutch and starts using that as a weapon as well.
Felt like a very scrappy scene, and I think a lot of the fights, except the final fight, felt really scrappy. And that's something I really, really enjoyed about it, because it was just, philosophy was the character's on the run, he's just going to be as resourceful as hell. It's the only way he's going to beat the kind of crueler and more underhand tactics of these people. And really, both somehow feel honourable, yet scrappy and brutal at the same time, and it's really, really nice balance.
The moment where I felt the scrappiness the most was when he was climbing that building, using nothing, just using his hands, and that was it. He didn't have any rope to get up the building, he was just purely climbing it.
I think if I had one other fault with this film, it's that the main romance just felt a bit
underdeveloped or tacked on. Yeah, I would agree.
Like, it was kind of just there. And to one of what I thought was one of the dumbest moments in the film, which was, oh hey, there's a second antidote to this poison they can't possibly have known about in the sword. Well, no, to be fair, they didn't know about it because it was a poison from the Yurika thing. But it's like, why would you have a second antidote in your sword? Like, I get you having a second antidote. Why would it be in your sword? Like, if that hilt gets whacked once, that vial is breaking. It's made of glass, for God's sake.
It was extremely convenient. It was sort of like, oh wait, here's the way to like save the after she gets like hit by the poison. It was a convenient way to save her. I was more wondering like, okay, was that actually set up, or did that just purely come out of nowhere?
The slight setup, because it was like, oh, a ninja's katana can heal as well as kill, but like that felt really metaphorical when they said it. Making it literal, I was kind of just there like, really?
I was kind of okay with that, just because are they going to do the stuffed in the fridge trope? I was kind of glad that she didn't end up dying.
You say that, but they basically had their cake and ate it with that. She was pretty much gonna die, so you had the motivation of the female's death, or imminent death, prompting the male hero to fight even harder and win the day, which is literally the trope. And then they undercut committing to that with, I think, the saved her, which just felt, somehow it was even worse for me. It almost felt a bit more like claiming a trophy than it did a logical story decision, if you get what I mean. Like, it felt, because I didn't particularly buy the relationship that hard, it felt almost like, you can't kill off the girlfriend, they've got to go and have a happy life. It's a bit like, don't even start to kill her off. Not last minute anyway, for stakes. It's not even the damsel in distress trope, which sucks, but can work. It was, oh hey, we're going to hurt with the trope. We're not going to commit to it because that makes us better and gives them the happy ending, and it just doesn't, because you've done the trope.
I didn't really have a problem with the romance element. They didn't have a lot of chemistry. It wasn't particularly like developed either. What I kind of more felt with like her character is that you're talking about with that trope, that is quite interesting. I felt they were more doing that, having a trope but not fully committing to it. They were kind of doing that more with her character throughout, where I felt like they were making her a competent badass who could take care of herself and didn't need saving up to a point. They did have her be competent and be able to like fight people. Basically, still had to keep on like saving her, and that was more what I had a problem with. Yeah, her being competent is good, but she should be competent for.
They did have to commit to that choice, and it wasn't committed to.
Like, she had to be both the action girl but also the girl, if that makes sense.
When James Bond can do it better, that's a problem.
If I did have one overall problem with this film that does hold it back from being more entertaining than it could have been, it's that as good looking as the film is, there are some like bad technical things that they do. That there are two main bits that I think are examples of that. One of them, unfortunately, is the CGI blood, which is very, very noteworthy and very distracting.
Yeah, I noticed it's a thing with a lot of these martial arts, especially those ones. Like, I was watching one yesterday called Ninja Assassin. Don't watch it. The CG blood just never lands right. They either don't have the money to do it right, or they don't spend enough time getting the shadows right and getting the kind of lighting on it right. So it always pops out distractingly. It's like when you're first learning to do gunshots. You don't take out the black background properly and all that kind of stuff. So it just stands out because none of the lighting is balanced. That's what it was.
I mean, that's just a thing about CGI blood in general, is that just generally speaking, it doesn't look like real blood or anything like that. And yeah, the way it lands is kind of off as well, because there's a certain way that blood just sprays, or that you can make blood spray through food coloring or fake blood. It is unfortunate because, you know, it's a bloody film, but when most of the blood is fake, that means that it's not quite as effective as it could be, because blood was just put in there in post.
I mean, I wonder if they didn't have the money for squibs. But then squibs would surely be cheaper.
They could have had money to do a throat slit or do cut on the body that would then create the blood. Could be that maybe they wanted to save money and they just decided, all right, let's just do some slashing and then we'll put everything else in post.
It stuck out and it took a little bit of a bite out of the fights. Luckily, the choreography was still quick and brutal enough that it didn't completely destroy what they were committing to, but enough an impact that we're mentioning it.
And then there's the other one as well. There was a big problem. Utilizes this. I'm sure that there's probably another word for this, but this is the word that I'll use. This basically pan-in scan that I found very, very obnoxious. Camera moves suddenly to one place and then moves to another place. You know, it's that kind of like what we.
I don't think that's a technical flaw. I think that's a style choice. Like, don't get wrong, I'm not 100% on board with it either, but I've seen it used before and working. I wouldn't call that a technical flaw. It's use of a technique, yeah, perhaps, or overuse of a technique, I'll give you. You can do that camera move and it can work. It's effectively consecutive whip pans. I've seen whip pans get done. They can work and they can add style, but you shouldn't stack them like that, or at least not in my opinion, because, yeah, I agree with you. It kind of felt destabilizing. I'd say what they were trying to do with it was create a almost surrounded on all sides sort of appeal and put you in Casey's mindset as he was going, shit. It wasn't necessarily wrong, but I don't think it was executed well, and I'll say that.
It did feel like a choice that they were committing to. It made the film look cheaper. It took away from the visuals, like from what they were actually showing. There's other stuff that you can critique as well. Like, you know, there's definitely some very like cliched, corny dialogue. Some of the acting is kind of, you know, a bit shaky, and you know, and characterization is fairly thin.
On the acting, I would say I quite enjoyed Scott Adkins' performance for what it was. It wasn't good, but it wasn't bad.
It was fairly standard, you know. I don't think he was ever totally wooden. He didn't necessarily have like a big range of emotions.
Obviously, the villain we were both quite impressed with performance-wise. I'd say did a good job, to be fair.
I'm playing a pretty generic Japanese master character. There is a weak link acting-wise. It was the guy who played the head of that corporation, Illuminati criminal cult. His delivery was not very good. He's kind of hamming it up, but not in a way that I found very entertaining. Aside from those problems, it pretty much fulfills, you know, its purpose as just a 90-minute simple action film that includes a lot of martial arts. So if you like that, then you'll probably enjoy it.
It's great for watching choreography. It's visually quite all right, and it's a good time. If you're looking to be challenged by what you're watching, I wouldn't say that this is one to watch, but other than that, yeah, it's an enjoyable time. I would recommend it if you just fancy an easy watch.
So to move on to the other one, Avengement. The plot of this one is a guy who gets sent to prison after a criminal action that he basically has to commit goes wrong, and he ends up getting sent to prison, and he then comes out a totally changed man. He then goes after the people that have wronged him, and the way that the story is kind of told is that we start with him escaping from prison and then going to the spa, and he then ends up confronting these criminals, and he then ends up bringing his brother into it. And through that, we kind of see the development of how he got there, what he was doing, the entire like history and drama behind how he ended up the way that he is at the beginning of the film. The film itself, surprisingly, is a bit narratively complicated because, again, it does have this kind of non-linear structure. You start basically with him, Kane, the Scott Adkins character. He's in prison and he's being taken to see his like dying mother, and then he comes in and his mother's already dead. And then he comes out, he escapes. We see him go to this bar. He starts this situation. He has the shotgun, and then he ends up telling the story of how he got there. And not only is he thinking about stuff that happened like a whole bunch of years ago, but there are even things that happened in between when he escaped and when he got to the bar that later on end up getting summarized. This was a lot better than I expected.
I think it worked quite well. It felt a little bit like not a kitchen sink kind of film, but like one of the more classical British crime films. I thought it was a crime film and a martial arts film. This film loves to fight. I think it's a crime film.
That is the thing that's noteworthy about it. You know, like whilst Ninja, it was all about Japan and then America. In this one, it's Brit. It's got like a very urban in that kind of Cockney sense.
It's got a real East London aesthetic, like proper East End London aesthetic. Like you've got it feels like a world almost entirely populated by pubs and corner shops and things like that. Other than obviously the hospital and the prison. It's
basically, you know, Scott Adkins kind of doing his take on one of these Cockney gangster films, not like Guy Ritchie, but kind of more low key, like, you know, Rise of the Foot Soldier or Bonded by Blood.
Not like the modern, more stylized ones that we've been doing recently, like Layer Cake, the Gentleman, things like that. Not in that sort of vein, but more on the lines of the opening of The Long Good Friday.
If you look at like the supporting cast as well, it's almost like a who's who of guys who have been in these kinds of movies. Like, one guy was from like Green Street, the main villain of it, Craig Fairbrass. He's been in a bunch of these movies as well. So it's like that, right? And that immediately like gives it a sort of unique identity. But what I think makes it work quite well, it's absolutely familiar. You know, it's definitely one of the guy gets screwed over and then he has to get revenge on people. But I think that the things that make it stand out to me is, first of all, that kind of narrative structure, because it does make it feel a bit less simplistic.
So I agree with that. I think what I really liked about the narrative structure in the film is it leaves you unclear of exactly how dangerous this guy is. You know, he walks in and you're like, all right, this is quite bad, but you're not, like, you figured out how he's a protagonist, but you're not sure if he's justified or not at all. Like, when he goes in there, you've got no idea what he's really capable of, because it's not like he walks in there immediately and starts bashing people to pieces. Sort of get bits of the story as it goes on, and then suddenly it's like more and more like they're in with the caged animal, which is quite interesting.
There's the way that he's introduced. They obviously do give him that sort of sympathetic thing, coming to see his mother, and then his mother ends up dying and he still wants to look at her body, and you do get that. But largely speaking, your first view of this guy is he almost looks like the crazy henchman that you would expect in like a crime film, you know, or the crazy henchman of the crime boss.
He looks like the top lieutenant enforcer sort of guy.
But then as the film goes on, you see that he wasn't always like that. And then you see he gets to be like that, how he, like the various injuries that he obtains and all of the drama that goes on with him. It makes for, I feel, a very well characterized protagonist, because he's a character who is at once really threatening and scary, but also quite sympathetic.
Sad. It is a sad story that he's got.
Like the very first like chronological thing that you see happening in the story is that he's coming in to meet his criminal brother. I think he's being like chastised because he didn't like throw this martial arts fight that he was basically doing.
It felt like the classical setup of the gangster being mad at the fighter for not throwing the boxing match or whatever, but it was clearly more like some sort of UFC thing. And then to win back trust so that he could get his brother's help, he had to do a crime.
Appearance wise, he looks kind of clean cut. He's still got that sort of Cockney accent, but it's not as rough. We don't necessarily see the actual crime in progress until a bit later on. But once you get it later on, it almost works as a revelation and reveal, because it's the moment where his character ends up doing something that he's not particularly proud of, because he basically has to just rob this woman and take this like bag or something from her. I don't think we ever know what's in the bag. It might have just been money.
It was money or drugs.
To grab it as well. And this woman actually manages to keep up with him as well, which was kind of surprising. And she ends up being like hit by a car, you know, and that really like shakes him, because he wasn't planning on killing anybody. He was just planning on, you know, like just robbing this woman, and then that's it. He even said, "I'll give you back your purse, but I got to take this." If it helps to greatly like humanize him, and even honestly, even in the prison scenes where he's nice part just beating up people, not only does he take a lot of blows himself, but he also, you know, has a good reason as well. For the most part, he is just fighting in self-defense.
Like the whole prison bit puts him on the offensive. The only time that he's actually really on the offensive is when he gets into that pub. But everything else is kind of just, I think it casts quite a poor picture of UK prisons, actually, which is quite interesting, because it criticises like the fact that you can quite easily put, you know, first-time offenders in with like all the really violent ones. And
I was thinking to myself, at this point, he should probably just be transferred to another prison, and could say that is kind of implausible. But you could also argue, I have no clue how UK prisons work, so maybe that is a problem, that they are just sort of keep them in this like hostile environment. If they do anything, then that's their fault. Good of you to like pick up on it of criticism.
It wasn't what I was expecting from it. Like when I went into it, I was expecting a bit of a Eric action film. But what I sort of got was actually something quite a bit more interesting for me.
Surprisingly, there is a sense of actual dramatic like pathos to the film that is shown through the family relationship, and also the relationship like between him and his mother that we kind of see in these brief scenes. I quite like the moment where he wants to tell his mother that his brother was like basically getting people to try and kill him in prison, but once he finds out that his brother is actually helping his mother with like her cancer, then he ends up not wanting to tell her. And the main thing at the end that you kind of find out is that he's not just purely doing it out of revenge, he's also trying to actually help the people who his brother screwed over.
At the start of it, it seems like it's a really straightforward revenge thing. You know, it doesn't seem like he's the most heroic person as such. It just seems like he's, you know, very rightfully pissed, and that's the kind of film you're going to get. And then You get like double whammy, and what was keeping him going through wasn't revenge, but it was the idea that he could help those other people, like had the names on the fucking walls and things like that. I thought that was really cool.
It does ultimately make him a lot more sympathetic, because that was what was keeping him going. Just the idea of helping others. I think it was also just the idea of redemption, you know, him like redeeming himself for getting that woman killed. It does actually manage to be decently dramatically involving. What also works as well is that although it's like Cockney, it's a bit unapologetically like Cockney and rough and violent as hell, but it's not laddish, not even that heavy on the swearing. I mean, like, you swear a lot, but they don't throw the word cunt around so much, and that kind of helps. It's not just pure testosterone filled like man movie where it's like people swearing, people beating people up. There is actual
art to it.
Interesting, because obviously the main relationship is not only fractured but ultimately completely antagonistic. But I think it is the character that we follow that does add the heart, and also the stuff with the mother. I think that does add the heart to it.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad that they had the mother in there, because it kind of gets an idea of what two influences in Kane's life were. You kind of end up with this almost hybridized. I think they do a great job at Shine cares for his mum. You get the idea that he could have made a more move before he did, but he wouldn't do it when his mum was still around.
So what's a bit vague is whether or not all of the things that he does when he escapes, and even his own escape, was just purely done on a whim, or whether or not he was legitimately planning it. It felt more like it was on a whim to me.
I think it was, because he saw that his mum was dead. He didn't have that reason to not do it now.
He was going to see his mother, and he knew that she was going to die anyway. He knew, okay, she's close to death, so this will be my last chance, maybe. And it could be like when he was going to go and see his mother, that then he was thinking to himself, I'm going to go and see her, and then when she dies, then I'll go on this path. But her dying immediately kind of just set him immediately on that path. And it gave him also the opportunity to go on that path anyway, because, you know, he was able to get out, you know, because it was already in public, basically.
It's like everything in that moment crystallized into the perfect thing that made Gwen was like, cool, I can go. It's a great example of an inciting incident.
It's why it makes sense for them to, like, you know, open with that as well, you know, because even though it's not chronologically the first thing that happens, but it works a lot better to start there and then go to the bar and leave everything else a mystery, and then bring those things in later on, like, you know, the scene with the accountant. Because if you showed that early on, it would have just given away so much, but it's kind of good that they didn't do that. Storytelling wise, it's very solid, but it's felt like the fight scenes, I think that they're excellent as well.
Stuff in the prison was just so rough.
The curb stomping bit was...
yeah. They linger with it as well. That's the thing that hits me. Show you the curb stomp, you see the teeth break. It really gives you an idea of what that pain. And that's one thing that these fight scenes do really well. They let you sit in the pain.
They do emphasize, you know, the bones breaking, or the scrappiness of it, and the scrappiness of some of the fights, particularly that final fight at the end, the bar one. I think the most like painful one was probably the bit where, you know, he's just in that room and he's getting like, he tries to fight back, but he just gets beaten up by the interrogator guy, the police guy, and, you know, rubs his face in the blood and stuff like that, just because like he was just out of pure, as much as he tried to fight, he was just out of pure disadvantage. That made the moment where he then got revenge on that guy a lot more like satisfying.
That was such a satisfying fight. I think the final one as well was just so well done, because it, again, used the environment really, really well. The weapons really well, and it just felt like a proper Herculean effort.
As much as it was an effort, it was also definitely a showcase of badassery, especially at the end when they showed him, you know, like making himself that beer and just drinking and just kind of standing there in silence and not really saying anything, because almost like he couldn't even believe it himself.
He let him grab the gun and take the shot, and he was just there like, did you not count?
The brother himself, like, he's not really the best villain, but character-wise, something that I quite liked about him is that they did ultimately emphasize that he was just somebody who would just stand back and let others do stuff for him. That was something that they emphasized well throughout the film, but particularly in that final bit. He basically sends out all of his men against Kane. They end up all getting beaten and killed. And then he's just kind of there, and I mean, he has the gun and he goes for the gun, but he doesn't actually try and like challenge him in a fight until right at the very end. And it is basically a curb stomp battle at that point. So short-lived. Like, Kane just like takes the knife and just stabs it and kills him, and that's it. And that kind of creates an interesting, you could say it creates an interesting like hero-villain contrast as well.
It's nowhere near an even fight, and it's the skill of the one person rather than the resources.
Yeah, and on that note as well, we should also talk about like Scott Adkins' contributions. Adkins has a reputation that he's not that great of an actor, but I think that this is probably the one that challenges that the most, because he is legitimately, I would say he's really good in this movie. I would say this actually shows that he can act quite well.
Yeah, no, sure, I'll give you that, because he does get a bit of flack because he's in a lot of more generic film, so he can get a bit of flack for not being the best actor. But like, he pulled off a really competent performance in this. You just got how bitter this guy was,
and the threat level as well, because he's very much like at the opening bit. I was kind of struck because it's such a like hard turn from his acting in like Ninja and a bunch of other movies that he's been in as well. Watching this like clean cut, almost like Hollywood looking actor, basically watching this guy who it almost looked like he was auditioning for the role of Victor Zsasz in a Batman film.
He told me that he was going to play a Great White Shark from Batman. I'd be so on board with that.
That's the kind of performance that it feels like, first of all, especially with the scars and especially with like, the makeup and the teeth.
Animalistic.
You see him again looking more normal, playing it down to earth, cool at the beginning, and then you see him getting more and more aggressive as the film goes on, and then you see him obtaining these injuries. Again, it's that case where it's not just like the physical stuff. Like, yeah, the physical stuff he does well, but you kind of expect that at this point. Vocally, he does really well. He makes the accent a lot rougher as it goes on. He's very threatening, and he does emote sympathy when he needs to. And it's a good showcase for also him actually having a bit of range as well, because he has to make those changes.
Really show that if you give him some material to work with, he can work with it.
The guy who did this movie did like 2 other films with him as well. So it's probably also a level of familiarity with like, the person that he's working with. And maybe the director of this movie wanted to like push him and show that he actually had some talent. The film is definitely raised by him, because I feel like if he came off as unconvincing in the role, the film would be a lot weaker. I think that the action is also definitely a big selling point. Again, it's brutal, it's gritty, it's well shot as well. It's definitely not, it falls into that category like somewhere in between close shaky cam and wide shots, where it's sort of close up, but never like so close that you can't tell what's going on.
I like getting close to people, but it's changing enough distance for there to be moments of objectivity, moments of surveying the room and things like that. I think it works really, really well, to be honest, the way it's shot. It feels intense and personal throughout the whole thing. It never really lets up, which is nice.
The way that it looks, I quite liked. It helps it not feel quite so like low budget, even though when you analyze it, a lot of the film does take place in rooms, but that's almost not something that you notice because it looks really good, and it never feels like they're necessarily compensating. It just feels more okay. The film just takes place in a lot of rooms because that's the setting of a lot of scenes. I think there's only like one bit where there's any major outdoor action, and that's just like the chase bit. There's really only one flaw that I can think of, and that's just the plotting can get a bit complicated because they're adding so much. It does start out simple, and then you have the non-linear stuff, and then they add a lot of stuff on top of it as well. And I think that means that like if you're not invested, then you might lose track of what's going on. But I think if you're invested, then you'll end up being like, oh, okay, that's interesting. All right, that's a new thing they're adding. That's a new thing they're adding. That's a new thing they're adding.
Yeah, I think it's a film that can invest you, and if you let it invest you, you're really going to love it. I think Avengement is a pretty good film, actually. Well worth your time. It's very violent and a lot of language. If that's the kind of stuff that you don't really like to see, I'd probably recommend giving it a skip. But yeah, I'd say as a story, in terms of most of the performances, I think it's really, really solid.
If you have like kind of a low opinion of like, the low budget action genre or of these like kind of cockney gangster films, it's one that will probably surprise you because, it does feel like there was a lot of effort put into it. It's not necessarily a film where they take that many risks story-wise necessarily. There is stuff that will feel a bit familiar to you, but I feel like, structurally, in terms of Adkins's performance, in terms of the fight scenes as well, it's one that does go for it and maybe tries harder than most. And I think it ends up being successful. I mean, we'd recommend both, but, just for Avengement is a lot better. And, I think both of them, although they star the same guy, they're both kind of targeted at different audiences anyway.
I would say Avengement will probably go down better with an English audience.
Next episode, we're going to be doing another double feature, this time on 2 films that are a bit more connected. Saturday Night Fever and its sequel, Staying Alive.